Picture yourself standing in a queue, but this is not a line for concert tickets or the grocery store. It is a waiting line for survival, where every single second you stand still is a second your body is actively dying from a lack of oxygen. This terrifying scenario was the grim reality within the notorious death zone near the summit of Mount Everest during the climbing season of 2019. Donald Cash was a titan of industry, a man who had cultivated a lifetime habit of winning at everything he touched. He operated under the firm belief that with a large enough budget and rigorous preparation, failure was simply not an option. He did in fact reach the top of the world, but the mountain would not let him return to tell the tale. On his descent, he found himself gridlocked in a massive human traffic jam right at the treacherous Hillary Step. His Sherpa guides fought tooth and nail to keep him alive, acting with absolute heroism. They surrendered their own oxygen supplies and physically carried his weight, gambling their own lives to give him a fighting chance. However, at an altitude exceeding 28,000 feet, even the noblest acts of heroism encounter the brutal laws of physics. Ultimately, the guides were forced to make the most heart-wrenching decision imaginable: abandon their client on the frozen trail to ensure they did not die alongside him. How does a long-anticipated moment of glory spiral into a nightmare where even the rescuers are forced to flee for their lives? To understand this tragedy, we have to rewind the clock and reconstruct the timeline of this expedition, starting from the moment the dream was born. Visualize a vast, blindingly white salt flat with a massive rusted-out beast of a car tearing across the horizon. It is a 1952 Buick that looks like it belongs in a junkyard, yet it screams across the ground at speeds topping 160 miles per hour. Behind the wheel sits Donald Cash. At 55 years old, he is completely in his element, thriving on the adrenaline. But between 9 and 5, Donald is a completely different animal. He serves as the vice president of global sales for the tech giant BMC Software, commanding respect in boardrooms around the world. Everyone in his professional circle knows the score if there is an impossible contract to sign or a rock star employee to recruit. Donald is the headhunter you call. He earns a staggering income and enjoys a life of opulence and luxury at his home base in Utah. Yet he refuses to spend his fortune on the mundane or the boring. Cash has zero tolerance for the stiff, gray atmosphere of corporate life. You will never catch him in a drab suit. He prefers neon-bright wardrobes and always sports a pair of rare, limited-edition sneakers on his feet. The man also possesses a wicked, unpredictable sense of humor. Imagine the scene: the vice president of a major corporation strolling into a high-level office meeting, dressed in a fluffy pink tutu and wearing a pair of fairy wings. That was his costume for Halloween the Tooth Fairy, because he genuinely does not care about maintaining a stuffy image. He just wants to have a blast. He constantly craves that dopamine hit, which explains why he purchased Bombshell Betty, that monstrous vehicle built for land speed records. This mechanical beast was engineered for one thing only: raw velocity. For Donald, it is far more than a pricey toy for a midlife crisis. It represents his core philosophy, a concept he refers to as calculated risk. He is absolutely convinced that you must feel the blood pumping in your veins right here, right now. Most men hitting their mid-50s are content to purchase a fishing boat or sign up for a relaxing golf club membership. Donald, however, is wired differently. Tearing across the ground at breakneck speeds is no longer satisfying his hunger for adventure. The Bonneville Salt Flats are perfectly flat, offering only a two-dimensional thrill, and Donald is searching for a third dimension. He needs to level up the difficulty, seeking a challenge that cannot simply be purchased off the lot at a luxury car dealership. A grand scheme begins to take shape in his imagination. He does not want to climb just one mountain, he wants the whole set. He sets his sights on the 7 Summits Challenge, an exclusive club reserved for those few who have stood atop the highest peak on every single continent. 7 distinct giants spread across the 4 corners of the globe, from the frozen eternal wastelands of Antarctica to the blistering sun-baked rocks of Africa. To the average person, this sounds like absolute lunacy or a superhuman feat. But for Cash, he views it as just another high-stakes business project to be managed. The only difference is that instead of a climate-controlled corner office, his workspace is a glacier, and instead of competing companies, his adversaries are thin air and hypothermia. He wants to test if his theory of calculated risk holds up in the vertical world. He begins to tackle these mountains with the exact same strategic mindset he uses to crush quarterly reports at his billion-dollar corporation. Donald is a pragmatist to the core. He harbors no romantic illusions about his abilities. He is fully aware that he is not a professional athlete with titanium lungs, Nor is he a rugged outdoorsman who spent his youth scaling cliffs. He lacks the decades of experience required for this game. So he leverages the one resource he has in unlimited supply, his bank account. Cash hires the premier commercial guide services and outfits himself with the most technologically advanced gear money can buy. His logic is simple, cynical, and efficient. If you do not know how to rebuild a transmission, you hire a master mechanic. If you do not know how to survive in the death zone, you pay experts to handle the survival part for you. He is essentially attempting to purchase safety and expertise off the shelf. The journey kicks off in Africa back in the year 2015. The first target on his ambitious checklist is Mount Kilimanjaro, towering nearly 20,000 feet above sea level. Technically speaking, it is not a technical climb. You are not dangling by your fingertips over a bottomless void. However, for a novice accustomed to an ergonomic office chair, it is a brutal shock to the system involving choking dust, extreme temperature swings, and an endless slog uphill. Against the odds, Donald powers through the discomfort. He stands on the roof of the African continent, snaps the victory photo, and marks the first big box on his list. The machine is in motion, and he has tasted the sweetness of success. Next on the itinerary is Europe. Sometime in 2016, he travels to Russia to face Mount Everest. The scenery shifts dramatically here. This is true mountaineering. Donald straps on crampons, razor-sharp spikes for his boots, and learns to wield an ice axe. It is an exhausting ordeal, but he methodically follows the broad back of his lead guide step by step. He places 100% of his trust in the professionals he has hired to keep him safe. The strategy works, and the second summit falls. By 2017, the stakes have escalated significantly. Donald flies down to South America to challenge Aconcagua. This mountain is in a completely different weight class, rising to nearly 23,000 feet into the sky. This is the point where the comfort zone completely evaporates. The atmosphere becomes so thin that every single step feels like running a marathon. His body is under colossal physiological stress, but Cash grits his teeth and refuses to complain. To him, this is a deadline that must be met regardless of the overhead costs. Running on pure determination, he successfully reaches the peak. He now holds 3 of the planet's 7 major summits in his portfolio. He feels unstoppable, like a winner who has solved the puzzle. It seems to him that he has cracked the code of high-altitude climbing. The formula in his head is flawless. Set the objective, throw money at the obstacles, hire the pros, endure the misery, and collect the reward. In his mind, these mountains have been reduced to complex tasks similar to orchestrating a corporate merger. He is supremely confident that every variable is under control and managed. He does not yet realize that this business school logic only functions up to a certain altitude. The next stop is Alaska, and the cold up there is a different beast entirely. While the peaks in Africa and Europe might offer a second chance here in the far north of America, nature plays for keeps. The 2017 climbing season opens, and Donald Cash sets out to conquer Denali, the highest point in North America. Veteran climbers often call this mountain one of the most honest peaks in the world. There are no Sherpas to haul your heavy load, and the weather turns faster than you can zip your parka. This time the mountain throws extreme conditions at him. The wind howls with enough force to knock a grown man off his feet, and the mercury plunges to life-threatening levels. Most other teams abandon their attempts and retreat, but Donald is not in the habit of backing down. He continues his upward march. He puts his faith in his guides and relies on his own stubborn perseverance. Step by agonizing step, pushing through a curtain of ice, he fights toward the objective. And he succeeds. Donald Cash stands atop Denali. The 4th of the 7 summits has been conquered, and he feels a surge of triumph. However, the mountain exacts a heavy tax on the descent. Donald removes a glove and instantly realizes something is horribly wrong. He has lost all sensation in his right hand. His fingers look alien. They are as hard as blocks of wood and completely cold to the touch. It is deep, severe frostbite. The merciless cold of Denali has bypassed his expensive gear and taken a piece of him. The medical verdict is blunt, brutal, and final. The tissue damage is irreversible. Donald undergoes surgery to have 3 fingers on his right hand amputated. Now, whenever he shakes hands to close a deal, his palm tells a story of loss. For almost anyone else, this would have been the end of the line. Losing body parts for a hobby is usually a massive red flag. It is the universe's way of telling you to stop, rethink your life choices, and retreat to the safety of a warm office. But Donald's reaction shocks everyone, even his closest friends and family. He looks at his maimed hand and sees no tragedy there. He does not spiral into depression. The injury fails to scare him off. Instead, Donald decides that he is now obligated to finish what he started, regardless of the price. He even cracks jokes about his new hand and orders custom-made mittens to fit his altered grip. He has absolutely no intention of quitting. Undeterred, Donald purchases a ticket to Australia in 2018. He already has 4 massive check marks on his 7 summits list, and leaving a project halfway done is a violation of Donald's internal rulebook. He flies to the opposite side of the globe to tick off the Australian continent. While different lists include different peaks for him, the goal remains identical: get the check mark, complete the set. He methodically executes the plan. His injured hand, tucked safely inside a specialized mitten, does not prevent him from scrambling up the rocks. He adapts to the new reality. If he cannot grip the stone like he used to, he simply finds a different way to hold on. To him, scaling a mountain isn't a spiritual journey. It's just another deliverable on a corporate checklist. A problem presents itself, he engineers a solution, and he immediately pivots to the next objective. Another peak in the legendary 7 Summits challenge is officially checked off the list. But Mother Nature isn't interested in his schedule, and she has a brutal exam waiting for him in January of 2019. Donald leaves civilization behind and journeys to the desolate bottom of the globe, the Vinson Massif in the frozen heart of Antarctica. The environment here is alien. The air is so dry it feels sterile in your lungs, and the sun hangs in the sky for 24 hours a day, refusing to give your eyes a moment of respite. The cold is a physical weight dropping so low that any patch of exposed skin goes numb in seconds. Donald grinds his way upward, pushing through the exhaustion. And once again, he executes the plan perfectly. He stands victorious on the highest point of the ice continent. Mission accomplished. But Vincent, much like Denali, before it demands a toll for the passage. When Donald finally stumbles back into the safety of his camp and peels off his gear, he discovers fresh damage. He looks in the mirror and sees that the tip of his nose has turned a sickening shade of black. The frost, relentless and cunning, had found a tiny gap in his armor. First it claimed his fingers on a previous climb, now it's coming for his face. He stares at his blackened nose and chooses to deflect the horror with humor. It's his primary defense mechanism. He cracks a joke about slowly shedding body weight to be lighter for the main event. No panic, no drama, just a laugh in the face of permanent disfigurement. His family, however, isn't laughing. They meet him at the airport, their eyes immediately drawn to the bandages wrapping his hand and face. They realize this is no longer just a hobby. It's an obsession that is physically dismantling him. But beneath the bandages, they see the wild intensity burning in his eyes. Donald is consumed by the goal. He is a man on fire, and his family knows that trying to forbid him from continuing would be like suffocating his soul. It would extinguish the very thing that makes him who he is. Reluctantly, his loved ones choose to stand by him. They hold their tongues and don't try to talk him out of it, even as a heavy cloud of anxiety fills their home, growing thicker with every sunrise. For Donald, the rest of the world has faded away. Only one piece of the puzzle remains. Everest, the highest, the most seductive, and the most treacherous graveyard on Earth. He possesses an unshakable confidence in his readiness. He has conquered 6 continents, he has survived near misses, and he has a squad of professionals watching his back. But what he fails to realize is that his previous injuries weren't just accidents to be shrugged off. They were omens. They were the final warnings from the wild warnings that he, in his ambition, decided to ignore. Now the clock is ticking down. There are only a few short months left before his flight departs for Nepal. Inside the expansive office of the vice president, the lights flicker off, and the heavy door clicks shut for the final time. Most men would cling to such a prestigious role in a major corporation with a death grip, terrified to let go of the status. But Donald operates on a different frequency. The calendar displays late 2018. Cash makes a radical, life-altering move. He submits his resignation to BMC Software, walking away from a lucrative career. In his mind, this isn't just a job change, it is a hard reset of his entire existence. Donald announces he is taking a sabbatical, a dedicated period of creative leave. He grants himself exactly 5 months of absolute unbridled freedom. No more boardroom meetings, no more quarterly projections, no more client conference calls. His life now revolves around a singular objective that demands total mental isolation. To ensure the world understands his commitment, Donald logs into his LinkedIn profile for one last corporate update. He highlights the prestigious line that reads, Vice President of Global Sales, and hits delete. In the void left behind, he types out a new whimsical title that he invented for himself, Chief Executive Mountaineer. When his former colleagues see the notification pop up in their feeds, they smile and shake their heads. To them, it appears to be just another eccentric antic from good old Don. But for Cash, this is a manifesto. He is done managing sales teams and hitting revenue targets. He is now solely responsible for managing his own survival. He has appointed himself the CEO of a project called Everest. Moments before departing, he grabs his smartphone and fires off a group message to his inner circle. The text is brief, but it drips with his trademark dark humor. Donald promises to return in June alive and with all my fingers attached. His friends read the screen and chuckle nervously, but the joke hangs in the air like a bad omen, as if he is taunting fate itself. It's as if Donald is shouting at the universe, "I've already paid my dues in flesh, you can't take anything else from me." But within the walls of his home, the bravado disappears. In the quiet evenings, Donald sits at the kitchen table across from his wife, Monette. Spread out between them are not travel brochures, but dry, cold analytical reports. They aren't planning a vacation. They are conducting a risk assessment. It resembles the preparation for a complex merger and acquisition deal. But instead of financial liabilities, the risks column is filled with terms like cerebral edema, catastrophic avalanches, and necrotic frostbite. Manette scans the grim statistics of Everest. She reads the data explaining exactly what happens to the human biological system in the death zone above 8,000 meters. She understands the horrifying reality. Even the fittest, most prepared humans simply begin to slowly die the moment they step into that altitude. The entire family is acutely aware of the stakes. They know the mountain is an indifferent beast that does not forgive arrogance. But Donald interprets those same documents through a different lens. Where his wife sees a death sentence, he sees a technical engineering challenge to be solved. He has a strategic plan, the finest equipment money can buy, and a dedicated team. He manages to convince his family, and perhaps himself, that he has the variables completely under control. Cash truly believes that his experience battling the elements on 6 other continents and his meticulous preparation are his shield. He closes the folder, sealing his fate. The decision is irrevocable. He is ready for the final push. But Everest in May of 2019 doesn't look like the sacred lonely peak of legends. It resembles a chaotic subway station at rush hour teeming with humanity. Donald lands in Nepal, and any romantic illusion of solitary struggle instantly evaporates. Base camp has transformed into a sprawling temporary metropolis of bright yellow tents, vibrating with the roar of diesel generators and a cacophony of languages from every corner of the planet. For this ultimate mission, Donald selects a Nepalese operator known as Pioneer Adventure. It's a budget-friendly outfitter that relies on high volume to turn a profit. You won't find Western luxuries or polish here, but you get local guides who have memorized every crevasse on the mountain. Donald finds himself embedded in a massive, eclectic platoon. 15 diverse clients from various nations are scheduled to make the summit bid alongside him. The group is herded by a single experienced high-altitude leader. Attempting to manage such a large crowd at that lethal altitude is a logistical nightmare bordering on negligence. But Donald remains unfazed. He is self-aware enough to know his limitations, so he decides to buy an extra layer of security. Donald pays to hire not just 1, but 2 personal Sherpas. Their names are Lhakpa Nurbu and Pasang Tenji. They are his private bodyguards, his lifeline in the death zone. While other climbers were pinching pennies, Donald was purchasing a double insurance policy. His strategy is simple, pragmatic, and unheroic. Consume as much supplemental oxygen as possible and never under any circumstances unclip from the safety lines that mark the path to the top. He isn't here to prove he's a Superman. He just wants to get up, snap the photo, and get down alive, treating the oxygen tanks like fuel for a machine. But the mountain has its own agenda for the season. The weather patterns in 2019 are behaving erratically. Historically, the spring season offers a few weeks of calm, stable skies where the jet stream lifts. But this year, the weather windows, those precious openings for a safe summit attempt, are collapsing, shrinking down to just a few sporadic days. This creates a terrifying bottleneck effect. Hundreds of climbers who have been rotting in their tents for weeks, waiting for a break, all get the green light simultaneously. The atmosphere snaps with tension. Everyone knows the geography there is only one route, a knife-edge ridge where it is physically impossible for 2 people to pass each other. When hundreds of desperate people launch their summit push at the exact same moment, it creates the one scenario mountaineers fear more than avalanches: a traffic jam in the death zone. But this isn't a traffic jam on a highway where the worst consequence is a cold dinner. Here, at the cruising altitude of a Boeing 747, time is not money. Time is literally the air remaining in your tank. Donald sees the weather reports. He understands the math. He will be forced to stand motionless in a queue on a vertical ice wall in temperatures plunging to minus 30 degrees. But he has come too far to turn around now. His 2-man Sherpa security team is prepped. His oxygen regulators are checked, and his determination is spiking off the charts. He takes his first step into the zone where human logic no longer applies, praying his redundancy plan will hold up in the coming chaos. At 8,000 meters, the world falls silent, save for the rhythmic hiss of gas into his mask and the rasp of his own struggling lungs. On the night of May 22nd, Camp 4 resembles an anthill that has been kicked open. Donald Cash unzips his tent and steps out into the freezing darkness. The wind has unexpectedly died down, the sky is crystal clear, and the stars are burning with the intensity of spotlights. It looks like the perfect night, but that perfection is a lure. Donald looks up the mountain and sees what veterans call the snake. It is a mesmerizing, continuous chain of headlamps winding vertically into the black void above. It is a stunningly beautiful sight, but to a professional mountaineer, it signals only one thing: an impending disaster. The traffic jam on the mountainside is nothing short of terrifying. Imagine more than 200 climbers all battling for the same treacherous patch of snow at the exact same time. They have all gambled on this specific weather window to push for the summit. It is into this chaotic, oxygen-starved stream of humanity that the Pioneer Adventure Group attempts to merge. It ceases to feel like a majestic mountain ascent and starts to resemble the checkout line at a chaotic supermarket on the evening before a major holiday. But the stakes here are infinitely higher. In a store, you can switch lanes or demand another register. Here you are trapped in a single file line where impatience can be fatal. Dozens of people are left simply standing there, clipped onto a single overburdened safety rope, waiting for the person ahead to move. The rhythm is agonizingly slow and disjointed. Take one heavy step, stop dead, wait for 5 freezing minutes, and then take one more step. For Donald, this stop-and-go torture is absolutely grueling. His body is already screaming, operating at its absolute physical limit. A climb that typically takes elite mountaineers 6 or 7 hours is stretching out into a never-ending 12-hour nightmare for Cash. This delay is not just annoying, it is biologically critical. Every single hour spent at this extreme altitude burns through the body's energy reserves faster than running a full marathon at sea level. Donald is moving with the sluggish heaviness of an astronaut fighting against crushing gravity. Every time he tries to lift his leg, it requires a monumental effort of sheer will, as if his boots are filled with lead. Fortunately, Lhakpa, Nurbu, and Pasang Tenji remain glued to his side, watching his every twitch and refusing to leave him alone for a second. His personal Sherpas have transitioned from being guides to acting like high-altitude guardians or nannies. They aren't just pointing out the route anymore. They are literally micromanaging his life support systems to keep him alive. One Sherpa focuses entirely on his safety line, constantly unclipping and reclipping Donald's carabiners to the fixed ropes, because Donald himself is moving too slowly to manage the gear. The other guide keeps his eyes locked on the oxygen regulator. They can see the truth clearly: their client is fading fast. The Sherpas understand the brutal math of Everest. The longer they spend dragging themselves up, the lower their statistical chance of surviving the descent. Yet the mountain offers a dangerous seduction. The weather is pristine, crystal clear, with not a single cloud marring the sky. This perfection plays a cruel psychological trick on the mind. Because the visibility is flawless and the wind has died down, it creates a deadly false sense of security. Donald feels like everything is going according to the plan, believing he is just a little behind schedule rather than in mortal danger. He remains completely oblivious to the fact that his internal battery is flashing red critically low. He sees himself surrounded by hundreds of other climbers all marching toward the same peak, and it creates a comforting but fatal illusion of collective success and safety. The clock ticks mercilessly past noon, a dangerous time to still be ascending, yet Donald is still pushing for the top. Below his boots, the earth seems to end dropping away into nothingness, while above him hangs the deep dark blue of the stratosphere. On the morning of May 22nd, Donald Cash manages to take one last agonizing step before grinding to a halt. There is nowhere left to climb. He is finally standing on the summit of Everest at an altitude of 8,848 meters. Surrounding him is a panorama that only a tiny fraction of humanity will ever witness with their own eyes: the distinct curvature of the planet and the jagged peaks of other 8,000-meter giants, which from this height look like mere foothills. But for Donald, this moment represents far more than just a beautiful view. It is the finish line of a personal marathon he has been running for years. The prestigious 7 Summits Challenge is officially complete. This office worker, who only began his climbing journey after turning 50, has just achieved a goal usually reserved for elite professional mountaineers. Africa, Europe, South and North America, Antarctica, Australia, and now finally Asia. He has logged the highest peaks on every continent. Donald is so exhausted, he can barely remain upright, but a surge of adrenaline keeps his blood pumping. He fumbles to pull out his flags, a mandatory ritual for the summit. He unfurls the banners, fighting a clumsy battle against the wind and the thick, clumsy mittens that make his hands feel useless. Lhakpa and Pasang pull out their cameras to document the achievement. The shutter clicks repeatedly. Donald poses desperate to freeze this fleeting moment of triumph so he can keep it forever. In the resulting photographs, he looks every bit the victor. Although his oxygen mask obscures his face, his posture screams of satisfaction. He is happy. But on the summit, time flows differently than it does on Earth. Every minute spent celebrating comes with a terrible price tag. The Sherpas nervously check their watches and glance back at the crowd of people still fighting their way up the narrow ridge. It is creating a traffic jam even here on a tiny patch of snow roughly the size of a dining room table. Donald needs to descend immediately, but he lingers. He reaches into his gear to retrieve a voice recorder or perhaps his phone. He feels an overwhelming need to send a message to the people waiting for him down below in the warmth and safety of the living world. He presses the record button. Through the static hiss of the wind and the plastic barrier of his oxygen mask, his voice is captured. It sounds halting and breathless, gasping for air, but the tone is firm. This message is for his wife, Monette, and his children. Donald does not hold back the flood of emotions hitting him. He speaks profound words of gratitude, thanking God for granting him the physical strength and the incredible opportunity to stand here on the very roof of the world. His voice vibrates with pure joy and relief. In these few fleeting seconds, Donald Cash understands exactly why he endured the biting cold and the screaming pain, and why he even sacrificed his fingers on Denali years ago. He is filled with a sense of absolute unblemished happiness. His lifelong dream has finally materialized. In his mind, the hardest part of the journey is behind him. He is on the summit, he is alive, and he has won. He has no way of knowing that this recording will serve as his final farewell to the world. The euphoria of his success completely masks the desperate distress signals coming from his body. He has already spent his entire energy reserve on the agonizing 12-hour climb. The Sherpas, sensing the danger, tap him firmly on the shoulder. It is time to move. Donald takes his first heavy steps down from the summit, but he only makes it a few meters. He is still at an extreme altitude, hovering just below the peak at around 8,800 meters. This is one of the most treacherous sections of the entire route, a knife-edge rocky ridge with zero room for error. Suddenly, without warning, Donald collapses onto the snow. He doesn't even put his hands out to break his fall. It is as if someone simply flipped a switch. The lights go out instantly. He loses consciousness right there on the trail. For Lhakpa and Pasang, this is the absolute worst-case scenario coming to life. Their client is now lying totally motionless on a narrow ledge. To his left is a sheer drop of several kilometers. To his right, an equally deadly abyss. And all around them, the scene is one of absolute chaos. Other climbers focused entirely on their own survival while heading to or from the summit literally step over and around Donald's prone body. No one stops to help. At this altitude, empathy dies. Everyone is fighting a solitary war for their next breath. Strangers dig their sharp crampons into the ice just inches from his still face, creating a surreal and horrifying tableau of indifference. The Sherpas, however, move with urgency. They know the golden rule of the death zone. If a climber does not get back up within 5 minutes, they will likely remain there forever. They immediately begin resuscitation efforts right there on the snow. Lhakpa frantically checks the mask and the regulator. He decides to gamble everything. The Sherpa cranks the oxygen flow to the absolute maximum setting. A powerful jet of pure oxygen, 4 liters per minute, blasts directly into Donald's starved lungs. This strategy is a massive drain on their limited resources. They are rapidly burning through the emergency supply they need for their own safe descent, but they have no other choice. The oxygen shock works. Donald's eyes flutter open. Consciousness returns with a violent jolt. He sees the concerned faces of his guides hovering over him, and he hears the whistle of the wind mixed with the ragged, desperate breathing of the climbers stepping past him. The most amazing thing is that he can speak. And he is making sense, not babbling. He understands exactly where he is and who is with him. His brain, suddenly flooded with high-flow oxygen, has rebooted. Donald tries to stand up, commanding his muscles to push his hands against the snow. And then a terrifying reality sets in. His legs refuse to obey him at all. He can feel them attached to his body, but they feel like alien objects, like heavy sacks stuffed with wet cotton. This is not just fatigue, it is paralysis. The altitude has attacked his cerebellum, the part of the brain that controls coordination and motor function. In a split second, the situation spirals from dire to hopeless. Lhakpa and Pasang try to hoist him up by his arms, dragging him like a wounded soldier on a battlefield. But Donald is a large man. When you account for his full high-altitude gear, his oxygen tanks, and his heavy boots, he weighs close to 100 kilograms. At the cruising altitude of a jumbo jet, a deadweight body does not feel like 100 kilos. It feels like a literal ton. The laws of physics are working against the rescuers, but for Lhakpa Nurbu and Pasang Tenji, the word impossible does not exist. They begin a descent that resembles a medieval battle against gravity rather than an organized evacuation. A helicopter cannot fly this high to save him. There is no way to use a stretcher on this terrain. The only way to get Donald off the mountain is to physically drag him. The Sherpas transform themselves into a human tow rope. They clip Cash directly into their own harness systems. One pulls from the front while the other pushes and belays from behind. It is back-breaking work. Donald is conscious and trying desperately to help pulling himself along with his arms, but his legs are just dead weight snagging on every jagged rock and icy ledge. The route here isn't a smooth, snowy slide. It is a torture track of sharp, snow-dusted rocks. The descent is infinitely more dangerous than the climb up, and the path winds precariously between sheer drops that lead straight to the bottom of the world. The Sherpa guides are reduced to physically lifting Donald's limbs, manually advancing his legs one excruciating inch at a time to prevent him from slipping into the endless void below. They are operating at the absolute breaking point of human capability. Every few yards, the forward momentum collapses as they pause, chests heaving, desperate to suck in whatever meager oxygen exists in this suffocating atmosphere. Then a catastrophe strikes. The oxygen supply is failing. Because they had cranked Donald's regulator to the maximum flow rate in a desperate bid to revive him, his canister is draining with terrifying speed. The needle on the pressure gauge is free-falling toward the red zone, signaling an empty tank. Deprived of that vital gas, Donald is guaranteed to lose consciousness within moments and perish shortly after. Lhakpa and Pasang exchange a heavy, knowing glance. No words are necessary in the howling wind. They resolve to perform an act of brotherhood that few would dare consider in the death zone. The guides disconnect their own regulators. They strip off their full life-sustaining oxygen canisters and strap them onto Donald's back. In exchange, they accept his depleted tanks or switch to backup bottles that are running on fumes. It is a selfless, almost suicidal gamble. They are voluntarily severing their lifeline, cutting off the fuel that generates body heat and powers their muscles solely to keep their clients' lungs inflating. By doing so, the danger to their own survival does not just increase, it skyrockets exponentially. Now navigating in a haze of partial asphyxiation, they continue to haul the dead weight of a fully grown man down the slopes. Even in this compromised state, they manage to conquer several dozen meters of the mountain's most treacherous terrain. They arrive at the infamous bottleneck known as the Hillary Step. This feature is a jagged knife-edge ridge with lethal drop-offs plunging thousands of feet on either side. It is strictly a one-lane road, and at this critical juncture, that solitary path is completely choked. A massive queue of aspiring summiters is slowly inching its way up from below, chasing their ultimate ambition. There are dozens of climbers in the line. They trudge upward with agonizing slowness, boot by boot, all tethered to the single fixed safety line. For a descending rescue team fighting against time, encountering this wall of humanity is effectively a death warrant. On a standard slope, you might unclip and skirt around slower traffic, but the Hillary Step makes passing a physical impossibility. With a bottomless void to the right and a terrifying precipice to the left, the center is clogged with a literal traffic jam of human bodies. Lhakpa attempts to scream, waving his arms frantically, pleading with the ascending crowd to yield for a dying man. But the climbers are locked in a trance of tunnel vision. Their entire world has narrowed to the crampons of the person directly ahead. Nobody looks back. Nobody moves aside because there is simply no real estate to occupy. The rescue is forced to a grinding halt. Their descent freezes entirely. This stands as the absolute worst-case scenario at an altitude of 8,800 meters. Motion is life up here. As long as you are climbing, your metabolism churns blood pumps and the body manufactures heat. The second you become stationary, the freezing temperatures invade your core like icy water flooding a sinking vessel. Donald collapses into the snowbank anchored to the rope while a sluggish procession of strangers' boots shuffles past his face. He waits. Lhakpa and Pasang wait. They are all prisoners of the mountain's overcrowding. The congestion clears with agonizing lethargy. 10 minutes bleed away, then 20. Then a full hour evaporates. Time seems to warp and stretch. All told, the rescue party is immobilized in this high-altitude gridlock for nearly 2 full hours. For Donald's compromised physiology, this delay is catastrophic. He remains static in the biting gale. Even though he is breathing borrowed oxygen, his core temperature is plummeting. The adrenaline and biological reserves his body marshaled after his first collapse are now completely exhausted. Hypoxia. The starvation of oxygen to the brain begins to creep back in rendering the mask ineffective. At this extreme elevation, atmospheric pressure is so non-existent that even supplemental gas cannot be properly absorbed if the heart isn't vigorously pumping it through the system via physical exertion. Donald, who had been lucid and attempting to assist in his own rescue just moments prior, begins to drift away. His eyes glaze over with a 1,000-yard stare, and his cognitive responses slow to a crawl. He offers no protest, no groans of pain. He is simply quietly extinguishing, much like a smartphone battery dying in the freezing cold. The Sherpas recognize the signs, but they are helpless to intervene. They cannot displace the mountain of humanity blocking their path. All they can do is stand witness as the precious final grains of their client's life slip through the hourglass, while the line of tourists desperate for a summit photo continues its slow, selfish crawl toward the top. When the bottleneck finally breaks, it is too late for Donald. Lhakpa Nurbu grips his shoulder and shakes him, but receives no reaction. The guide presses gloved fingers to the climber's neck. There is nothing. Donald's heart, battered by the freezing temperatures and the lack of pressure, has finally given out. The biological engine that had beaten for 55 years falls silent at over 8,000 meters. In this moment, the season's most desperate attempt at resuscitation begins. The Sherpas refuse to concede to the reality of death. They immediately initiate CPR right there on the perilous, narrow ridge. Try to imagine the sheer exertion required to pump a chest and force life back into a body in a place where merely lifting a hand costs you a fortune in energy. Other mountaineers shuffle past the scene. Some stare in open horror, while others avert their gaze, but not a single soul stops to assist. At this altitude, the only law is self-preservation. The two guides work in tandem, trading off compressions. 30 minutes drag by, then an hour, then 90 minutes. They refuse to surrender. For nearly 2 agonizing hours, they exhaust every technique they know to restart his heart. It is an eternity to spend exerting oneself in the death zone, a place where survival is typically calculated in fleeting minutes. But the mountain is a cruel creditor and returns nothing it has claimed. Around noon on May 22nd, a definitive silence settles over the ridge. The Sherpas finally cease the chest compressions. The realization takes hold: Donald Cash is gone. Biological death is irreversible. What remains on the rope is no longer a client to be guided, but a lifeless husk weighing nearly 220 pounds. Then the gravity of their own situation crashes down on them. In their frantic bid to save Donald, surrendering their oxygen and burning precious calories on resuscitation, they have depleted their own life support. A glance at their regulators confirms the nightmare their levels are critical. The gas is virtually gone. They have incinerated their energy reserves on a mission that ultimately failed. Now Lhakpa and Pasang are staring down the darkest decision any mountain guide ever has to make. There are only 2 paths forward. The first option: attempt to haul the corpse down the mountain. But without oxygen and shattered from the 2-hour CPR marathon, this is physically impossible. They would collapse before reaching the next camp and join Donald as permanent fixtures on the ice. The second option: save themselves. They look at one another, thinking of their families waiting in the valleys below. They had gone above and beyond the call of duty. The brutal logic of high-altitude survival demands a decision. With shaking hands, they unlock the carabiners. Donald Cash's body is left to rest near the Hillary Step, atop the very peak he had spent his life dreaming of conquering. The Sherpas turn their backs and initiate a frantic, rapid descent, trying to outpace the hypoxia and hypothermia that are now nipping at their heels. Their lungs scream for air, but draw in only thin, freezing emptiness. The guides know they are treading a razor-thin line between life and death. If either man falters, trips, or succumbs to the urge to sit and rest, he will never stand up again. And then an event occurs that defies all rational explanation. Pasang Tenji, himself teetering on the brink of unconsciousness, notices a shape in the snow ahead. It is another climber, trapped in the exact same lethal spiral. This stranger is out of oxygen, completely delirious, and physically unable to take another step. He is simply sitting there, resigned to his fate, waiting for the cold to take him. Pasang could have easily kept walking. No one in the world would have judged him for passing by. He is clinging to life by a thread, deeply traumatized by the loss of his client, and utterly drained. Every biological alarm bell is screaming, "Save yourself," but Pasang stops. His spirit cannot weather a second death in a single day. Tapping into some hidden, almost supernatural reservoir of will, the Sherpa grabs the stranger. He shouts into the man's face, startling him back to reality, and begins to guide him down the slope. It is an act of unadulterated heroism. A man with absolutely zero resources to spare is somehow sharing his life force with another. Against all odds, they manage to stagger into the lower camp alive. Pasang survives, and in doing so, he rescues a stranger as if balancing the scales for a tragedy that was never his fault. Meanwhile, halfway across the world in Utah, the phone rings. The Cash family receives the call they dreaded most. The initial shock eventually transitions into the need for a pragmatic, heartbreaking choice. Donald remains at an altitude of over 8,000 meters. To retrieve his remains would require launching a massive expedition involving 10 to 12 of the strongest elite Sherpas. These rescuers would have to gamble with their own lives, navigating those same lethal traffic jams and scaling vertical ice walls, all while maneuvering a heavy frozen burden. Monette, Donald's wife, gathers with their children to discuss the options. They know the man he was. Donald always prioritized human life and safety above any accolade. The family agrees that he would never forgive them if another person perished simply to bring down his empty vessel. The danger is simply too high. They arrive at a devastating yet undeniably moral conclusion. They will not attempt a recovery mission. They leave him to rest in the embrace of the mountain. The official death certificate cites high-altitude sickness. Medical experts theorize that his brain simply ceased functioning due to the extreme strain. However, his family holds a different conviction. They knew his vibrancy and passion. They believe his heart simply burst at the absolute zenith of emotion and physical exhaustion, that the sheer magnitude of the moment overwhelmed him. Now Donald Cash will remain eternally at the place he fought so hard to reach. His quest to scale these 7 summits was completed in the most absolute sense possible. He has not just conquered the peak, he has become an inseparable part of the mountain itself. Donald Cash didn't simply lose his life to bad luck or a slip of the foot. His demise was the inevitable result of a broken system collapsing under its own weight. Back in the spring of 2019, the government of Nepal decided to open the floodgates, authorizing an unprecedented number of foreigners to attempt the climb. They handed out exactly 381 permits, a figure that shattered every previous record in the history of mountaineering. Consequently, Base Camp transformed into a bustling, chaotic city of nylon and ambition absolutely bursting at the seams. Commercial outfitters arrived in droves, hauling in armies of paying customers, legions of Sherpa guides, and literal mountains of equipment to support the masses. Every single one of these hopeful souls sat huddled inside their tents, eyes glued to the skies, praying for the jet stream to lift just enough to allow safe passage. However, Mother Nature was in a cruel mood that season and refused to cooperate. Meteorologists sent back grim reports that shattered hopes across the camp. The critical weather window, that brief, magical period when the hurricane-force winds subside enough to support human life, was projected to last a mere 2 or 3 days towards the very end of May. In a normal year, climbers might have spread their attempts over several weeks, but this time everyone's itinerary was forcibly compressed into one incredibly tight time frame. This put the expedition organizers in an impossible predicament, caught between safety concerns and financial reality. They were responsible for hundreds of clients who had each shelled out tens of thousands of dollars for a shot at glory, and nobody was willing to tell them to go home empty-handed. This pressure cooker environment triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Almost every team stationed on the Nepalese south side made the fateful decision to launch their summit bids simultaneously to beat the closing window. As darkness fell on the night of May 22nd, a literal army of climbers clipped into the ropes, crowding onto the perilous knife-edge ridges in a desperate scramble for the top. The logistical nightmare was comparable to trying to funnel an entire sold-out sports stadium through one tiny emergency exit all at once. Donald Cash found himself right in the thick of this human bottleneck, marching upward as part of the initial surge of climbers fighting for space on the mountain. Tragically, he had no way of knowing that every step forward wasn't bringing him closer to triumph, but rather leading him deeper into a fatal ambush set by circumstance. Even as Donald's heart began to give out under the immense strain, the rest of the globe was about to receive shocking visual confirmation of the horror taking place in the death zone. It was right then that a climber snapped a picture that would instantly circle the planet, permanently shattering the romantic myth of Mount Everest. The image revealed a jarring, surreal sight, a continuous multicolored serpent made of puffy down suits stretching as far as the eye could see. Hundreds of climbers were jammed, chest to back, tethered helplessly to a solitary safety line, with nothing but a multi-thousand-meter plunge awaiting them on either side of their boots. The photograph spread across social media like wildfire, exposing the madness to millions. To the casual observer, scrolling through their feed, it might have looked like a frustrating line at a theme park, but veteran mountaineers looked at that image and saw a death sentence. When you are locked into a queue of that magnitude on a ridge, that high retreating is physically impossible. Overtaking a slower climber is out of the question on such narrow terrain, meaning the pace of the group is dictated by the most exhausted person. Consequently, climbers were forced to stand motionless at 8,000 meters for hours on end, and in those temperatures, lack of movement is a recipe for hypothermia and frostbite. However, the true horror lay in the simple act of respiration. Every second they stood there waiting, they were burning through their finite supply of bottled oxygen just to stay alive. That vital resource meant to power their muscles to the peak was evaporating into the thin air while they stood completely still. Trapped in that same gridlock, clinging to the exact same frozen ridge, was Anjali Kulkarni, a climber from India who would also lose her life that day. Her final hours played out in a scenario that mirrored the chaos, perfectly proving just how indiscriminate the mountain had become. She had actually achieved her goal and stood on the roof of the world, but her descent was blocked by the impenetrable wall of people pushing upward. Her energy reserves were completely depleted long before the congestion cleared, and she ultimately collapsed and died of pure exhaustion, while her Sherpa guides looked on helplessly unable to rush her to safety. When the dust finally settled, the casualty list for the season resembled a dispatch from a bloody battlefield rather than a sporting event. 11 lives were lost, in total 9 on the Nepalese slopes and 2 on the Tibetan side, marking it as one of the deadliest and most controversial chapters in the mountain's history. Media outlets around the world published scathing critiques about the commercialization of the Himalayas, forcing the government of Nepal into a defensive public relations battle. Yet no amount of finger-pointing or official inquiries could breathe life back into the climbers who perished frozen in place, victims of a literal traffic jam in the sky. Back home in Utah, the tragic news arrived alongside sensational headlines screaming about the carnage on Everest and a graveyard of tourism. However, Donald Cash's family refused to view the event through that grim sensationalist lens. To his loved ones, saying that he died doing what he loved wasn't just a comforting platitude to make themselves feel better. It was the absolute reality of the man they knew. Donald had studied the mountain, understood the lethal stakes involved, and accepted the high cost of admission before he ever took that first step. Consequently, the family made a pact there would be no somber black attire and no hushed weeping in a dark parlor, because that simply didn't fit Donald's vibrant personality. Instead, on the day of his memorial, his wife Monette and their kids organized a tribute that likely baffled those who didn't know them well. Dressed in full workout gear and lacing up their running shoes, they headed out the door to participate in a marathon together. They hit the pavement and ran mile after mile, dedicating every drop of sweat and every ounce of effort to the memory of their late father and husband. They gritted their teeth and powered through the grueling distance, choosing to process their grief through physical exertion. For them, the best way to honor a man who lived so intensely was to feel the burn in their lungs and the blood pumping in their veins rather than sitting still in sadness. They knew in their hearts that Donald, a man with a sense of humor, big enough to dress as the Tooth Fairy and wild enough to race beat-up cars in demolition derbies, would have demanded exactly this sort of high-energy send-off. Meanwhile, Donald Cash himself stays permanently on the mountain he fought so hard to reach. His remains rest forever at an elevation of 8,800 meters, just steps away from the famous Hillary Step. He has become one with the frozen landscape and the lore of Everest, a testament to a man who spent his 55 years on Earth living at maximum velocity, never taking his foot off the gas. His life's journey concluded at the precise geographic coordinate he had dreamed of for decades. He reached his ultimate destination, but the toll extracted for that brief moment of glory was far steeper than anyone could have possibly anticipated.